Om Sarashiva Samarambham Excuse me. Om Sarashiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Paryantham Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Good. Be seated, please. Very good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome back, and a special welcome to the many students watching these classes online. We come now to the final verses of chapter 18, and we saw before, Sri Krishna finished his spiritual teachings in verse 66, but he's not quite ready to stop. So we'll see his concluding statements today. We'll begin our recitation here with verse 70. I'm going to make sure this is working. Yes, okay. As I'm chanting, as always, please read the translation and then repeat after me. Adhyeshyate cha imam, adhyeshyate cha imam, dharmyam samvaramavayoho, dharmyam samvaramavayoho, jnana yajnena tenaham, jnana yajnena tenaham, ishtasyamiti me matihi, ishtasyamiti me matihi, shraddhavananasuyash. It didn't go. There we go. Shraddhavananasuyascha, shraddhavananasuyascha, shunuyarapi yo naraha, shunuyarapi yo naraha, sopi mukta shubhan lokan, sopi mukta shubhan lokan, prapnuyat punya karmanam, prapnuyat punya karmanam, kachade tachutam partha, kachade tachutam partha, tvayayikagrena chetasa, tvayayikagrena chetasa, kachirajnana sammohaha, kachirajnana sammohaha, pranashtaste dhananjaya, pranashtaste dhananjaya, arjnuvacha, arjnuvacha, nashto moha smritir labdha, nashto, sorry, problem here. Nashto moha smritir labdha, nashto moha smritir labdha, tvat prasaran mayachyuta, tvat prasaran mayachyuta, stitosi me, stitosmi gata sandehaha, stitosi gata sandehaha, Karishye vachanam tava, karishye vachanam tava. It seems like a nice place to stop our recitation, because what follows is just a few verses of Sanjaya speaking to Dhritarashtra. Before we pick up the thread today, there were several comments and questions regarding verse 66. Remember, we called this the Charama Shloka. It is the final verse, and meaning the final verse of spiritual teaching, of Upadesha given by Sri Krishna. And it has this powerful, amazing message, and we spent quite a bit of time discussing it. And discussing a number of factors about it. One thing we discussed is how that sarva dharman, parityajya, giving up, sarva dharman, giving up sarva, all dharmas. We discussed at some length how that got translated in various ways by various translators. And some of you commented that you found those comments where I reviewed how others translated that verse, you found them helpful. There was at least one person who found some of my words hurtful. Now, I made reference, for example, to Swami Prabhupada, the founder of ISKCON, the Hare Krishna movement, and I tried, I don't think I was critical about him. I said he was a Vaishnava missionary. He converted all of these hippies, got them off of drugs, got them to wake up early in the morning and chant mantras. How about that? That's hardly critical. But I did say that his translation of the Bhagavad Gita, it's called As It Is, and my comment was it's not exactly as it is. It really reflects his visionary, his Vaishnava missionary orientation, and this person was hurt by that comment. When I make, and this comes up from time to time, when I make comments about other traditions, I do understand that they can sound critical, but you also can understand that my intent is not to criticize, but this is a common teaching technique to teach by showing contrast, comparison and contrast. It's a widely used technique. It's used in every school in the world, comparison and contrast. And significantly, it's used in all our commentaries. They always bring in opposing points of view and then dismiss those opposing points of view. So it's very much part of the tradition, not to criticize, but this process of comparison and contrast. On the other hand, if my words sound critical, and especially if I hurt anyone, I apologize to the commentator, and the person who made that comment, I apologize to him. And if any of you or anyone watching these videos was hurt, I apologize. My intent is not to hurt anyone, but to teach through comparison and contrast. Next, a comment or question about, again, sarva dharman parityajya, giving up all other dharmas. And we talked about that at length in the last class, so I won't repeat those teachings. But here the person says, Advaita Vedanta also emphasizes that true liberation can only be attained through transcending all concepts, including moral distinctions. I'll say that again. Advaita Vedanta emphasizes that true liberation, moksha, can be only attained through transcending all concepts, including moral distinctions. This is we see this kind of teaching today more so than in ancient times. This idea of transcending morality. It is said, correctly said, that an enlightened person is beyond morality, beyond dharma and adharma. But does that mean that to achieve enlightenment, you should ignore the distinctions between dharma and adharma? Do you see the point? The enlightened person has achieved a condition where they're beyond dharma and adharma. And then you think, oh, they're beyond adharma and adharma. I want to be enlightened, so I'm going to ignore the distinction between dharma and adharma. You can see how defective that is. So the enlightened person is enlightened. If you're not enlightened, you must follow dharma, because following dharma is one of the means for gaining enlightenment. This is a common mistake. I've told this story before, but it is so perfectly suited for this. Allow me to share it briefly here. So there was a Swami with his disciples who walked to the beach, and the Swami was enlightened, and the disciples were not yet enlightened. And the disciples watch as the Swami wades out in the water, catches a fish, and eats it whole. And his disciples are aghast. He's always told us to eat vegetarian. And look, he himself is eating a fish. Then he grabs another and eats it whole, and another, and another. And his disciples are just, they said, we must have misunderstood our Guruji. Anyway, Swami comes up on the shore and lays down and takes a nap. And the disciples say, well, if he does it, it must be okay for us. So they go fishing. They catch a bunch of fish. They start a fire. They fry up the fish very nicely. They add their masala, whatever they add, and make it nice and tasty. Machli. Machli masala. They have a nice dinner. And then they also go to sleep. Next morning, they all wake up. The Swami wades back into the water, opens his mouth, and out jumped the fish. He was protecting them. And after the fish all jump out of his mouth and return to the sea, the Swami turns to his disciples and says, now you do that. Anyway, it's a hilarious story. This story has been told for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a wonderful story, but it makes a point, right? Enlightened people are not meant to be imitated. They're meant to be understood. So yes, it's true that an enlightened person is beyond dharma and adharma, but that also means that the enlightened person is free from raga and dvesha that compel people to perform adharmic deeds. So the enlightened person is completely freed from any impulse to do adharma. But they're beyond dharma and adharma in the sense that they're established in non-duality, which truly is beyond dharma and adharma. But that doesn't give disciples freedom to misinterpret and claim that beyond all moral distinctions. So the distinction between dharma and adharma continues up and until you are enlightened. One last question. Can I elaborate more on the portion of this verse, the last line, moksha yashyami, sarva pape, aham tva sarva pape bhyaha moksha yashyami. O Arjuna, I will free you from all sins. Yes, can I elaborate on that more? Turns out that all the commentators elaborate a lot on sarva dharman parityajya, and they don't pay much attention to this last part because it's not considered as important. I think I commented on, I said, Sri Krishna, first of all, I will free you from your sins. I drew a distinction, unlike the way Jesus frees Christians from their sins. Their theology is extremely different. I won't go into the details. How Jesus frees you from sins is a complicated theological thing. We need not go into it. But here we'll say that Sri Krishna freed Arjuna from his sins by making him enlightened. Enlightenment means you are no longer bound by the results of your past actions. You are freed from the bondage of karma. You are freed from association with the results of past karmas that have not yet been fructified. You're also free with regard to future karmas. This is very important for Arjuna, who's just about to start fighting against his own family members. Mortal combat. He's going to end up killing his own family members, and Arjuna has been paralyzed by this moral conflict. So Sri Krishna assures Arjuna that with the help of these teachings, Arjuna, you have become enlightened. Being enlightened, you are freed from the bondage of karma. You are freed from any association with those karmas. Therefore, ma shuchaha. Therefore, Arjuna, you need not grieve. Okay. And having finished those questions, we can pick up the thread. We saw verses 68 and 69 in a prior class, where Sri Krishna praised one who teaches the Bhagavad Gita, who teaches the sacred wisdom. So having spent these two verses, 68 and 69, which we saw at the end of the prior class, in which the teacher is praised, now the students are praised in the next two verses, 70 and 71. We'll see that. And adhyeshyate cha yaimam, adhyeshyate cha yaimam, dharmyam samvaram avayoho, dharmyam samvaram avayoho, jnana yajnena te naham, jnana yajnena te naham, ishtasyamiti me matihi, ishtasyamiti me matihi. Good. Yaha is the subject here. Yaha, one who adhyeshyate, one who will study. One who studies what? Imam dharmyam samvaram. Imam, this. Dharmyam, sacred. Samvaram, dialogue. One who studies the sacred dialogue, avayoho, dual, between us. The sacred dialogue between me and you, Arjuna. One who studies the sacred dialogue. What about that person? Tena, by that, jnana yajnena, by that worship in the form of gaining knowledge. And I'm going to come back to that word. Tena jnana yajnena, by that worship in the form of gaining knowledge. Through that aham, I, Sri Krishna says, I, ishtaha syam. I become ishtaha. For our Sanskrit students, this is a pun. It's a pun because the word ishta can be derived from two different roots. Ish to desire and yaj to worship. So the common meaning here, aham ishtaha syam, I become loved. I become dear. Yeah, I become loved, using the first meaning. But then it also means, words have different, words that are spelled the same can have completely different meanings. The example I've given here before is B-O-W. What am I talking about? Is it an expression of reverence? Is it the front of a boat? Is it an ornament on a present? Is it the sound your dog makes? You get the point. They're all spelled the same, but have completely different meanings. The word ishtaha is like that. It's spelled the same, the two completely different meanings, quite deliberately chosen, is aham ishtaha syam. I become dear to that person. but aham ishtahasyam, I become worshipped by that person, is a completely different meaning. It's completely grammatically correct, and it's actually contextually correct, because what is Sri Krishna talking about? Jnana yajna. Through the person who, jnana yajnena tena, through that jnana yajna, through that worship in the form of knowledge, ishtaha syam. The second meaning is actually better. I become worshipped by that person through their worship in the form of yajna. And this is something we have to note for just iti me matihi, just to finish the verse. Iti, thus, me matihi, thus is my opinion. And here, one more time, Sri Krishna is being critical, like I was being critical before. Sri Krishna is highly critical of ritualism, the excessive ritualism that existed in his time, where people were so focused on, and the main form of ritual was yajna, was a homa or havan, we use the words today, a form of ritual in which you offer many things into a sacred fire. Those offerings are consumed by the fire and symbolically transferred, given to Ishvara, the God of the cosmos. Sri Krishna here is critical of that. And one more time, in fact, this actually reaches back. I had to look it up, because he used that word jnana yajna once before in the Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 4, where he says, dravya shreyan dravya mayat yajnat. He says, what is better than yajna, worship, dravya mayat, worship in a form of making offerings. Dravya means thing. So and especially ghee. So better than offering ghee into a fire is jnana yajnaha parantapa. O Arjuna, worship in the form of knowledge is better than worship in the form of offering ghee into this fire. So Sri Krishna was critical then. In fact, his criticism of yajna, his criticism of excessive ritualism, began way back in chapter 2. And then in chapter 3 it continued. When he talks about karma yoga, he makes it very clear that performing rituals is karma. He says it's not karma yoga if you're performing that ritual for the sake of some blessings. To perform rituals for the sake of blessings most certainly is not karma yoga, and we won't talk about karma yoga here. We talked about it extensively through all these chapters. But here, my point here is that he's using this one more opportunity for one more criticism of this excessive ritualism. He says, instead of pouring ghee into that fire, better to worship me through seeking knowledge, spiritual knowledge, knowledge of me, Sri Krishna can say. If somebody made a kind of a sarcastic comment, you're pouring all that ghee into the fire, offering it to Ishvara. Ishvara wants ghee? I'm being silly, but you see my point. If Ishvara were like a person who could speak, would Ishvara say, give me more ghee? That doesn't make sense. What would Ishvara want? Ishvara is not like a human being. Ishvara doesn't have desires, but just for the sake of this discussion, imagine Ishvara. If Ishvara were like a human being, what kind of offering would he want? Not ghee. What would he want? He would want you to know him. Jnana. Jnana yajna. So worship through the form of knowledge. And in the last couple of classes, we talked about how the boundary between jnanam, knowledge, and bhakti, devotion, is deliberately blurred by Sri Krishna. For Sri Krishna, bhakti and jnana are inseparable because it is through knowledge of Ishvara that your bhakti grows dridha, firm, strong. So bhakti and jnanam are inseparable. So that's why he says here that jnana yajnena, through this worship in the form of gaining spiritual wisdom in general, but knowledge of Ishvara in particular. In this way, ishtahasyam. I become pleased, I become loved, is a fine translation, but also I am worshipped through this jnana yajna. Some of you may also know that my Parama Guru, Swami Chinmayananda ji, they called him Gurudev, he chose this particular word to refer to his lectures. It wasn't a commonly used word at that time. He popularized the word a lot by calling his lecture series Jnana Yajna. He would go to a community, and for 10 days or longer, he would give a series of lectures. And for him, this was his yajna. This was the way he was worshiping Ishvara, by teaching others. And when we talked about those two verses talking about praise of Guru, praise of teacher, we talked about that a lot, how the Guru's sadhana, spiritual practice, is to teach. Or we could say, instead of saying spiritual practice, why not we say the Guru worships Ishvara by teaching. Absolutely. And we saw that in a prior verse. So for Gurudev, for Puja Swami Chinmayananda ji, his worship was to go around the world for more than 5 decades, teaching people probably on almost every continent. Also, just a last comment. Some of you may not know that when he started out, you can imagine, he became an incredibly popular teacher. He was a very powerful orator, and people loved his teachings. Not when he started out. The story goes that when he gave his first jnana yajna, there were just a handful of people sitting there. He taught with full energy, even though there were only half a dozen people there. And each day more people came, and more people came, more people came, and it built up through the years. The point here is not the fact that he would teach with full commitment, even though there were only a half a dozen people sitting there, shows that his interest, his motivation, was not to convert people. His motivation was, although he himself, I have to back off there, he himself said very powerfully, he said that his role is to convert. You wonder, why is it called Chinmaya Mission? We should explain this. His organization is called Chinmaya Mission, but then you've also heard that Hinduism is not a missionary religion like other religions. So then you might wonder, why is his organization called Chinmaya Mission? Like Ramakrishna Mission, they also use that same word. Chinmayananda ji explained it very nicely. He said his job is to convert Hindus to Hinduism. Nicely said. And accurate. And that's what he spent his life doing. So this was his jnana yajna, his worship in the form of imparting spiritual knowledge. His sadhana was to convert Hindus to Hinduism. He did a great job. All right, then. Next. Shraddhavan anasuyascha Shraddhavananasuyascha Shrunuyarapi yo naraha Shrunuyarapi yo naraha Sopi mukta shubhan lokan Sopi mukta shubhan lokan Prapnuyat punya karmanam Prapnuyat punya karmanam. In the second line, yara yaha naraha, a person. What kind of person? Shraddhavan, full of shraddha, faith and commitment. Anasuyaha cha, and free from this negativity, free from disbelief, free from, actually the opposite of shraddha is this. People listen. Oh, I have to. Just a quick anecdote. When I first started teaching in the 1990s, I was not, in fact, early 1990s, I was not yet a sannyasi. I was wearing white in those days. I was giving public lectures every week at a university and at a big public library in Bethlehem. And I still remember that I would show up for class and I'm teaching the same things, maybe in a more accessible way. For the audience was largely Western origin. There were fewer people of Indian origin there. But I always noticed that in the back row, there were also always a few, usually men, sitting like this. You know something about body language? By the way, if you're sitting like this, don't worry about it. Some people just like to do that. That's okay. It's not a problem. But these guys, last row, always sitting in the last row and sitting like this. And then I would always have question-answer session at the end of each class. And then it's always these people who would have the really challenging questions and all of this. That's what Sri Krishna is referring. Anasuyahacha, the one who are free from that kind of attitude, free from that mental block. And by the way, that's what this is, right? You are blocking out anything outside, and you are protecting yourself. So that's and again, if you're sitting like this, it doesn't mean anything, but that's what it was not true in your case. It was absolutely true in their case. So they were the opposite of who Sri Krishna describes here. Shraddhavan, full of faith. Anasuyahacha, pure heart. That's a nice translation. What about them? Shunuyat api. When they hear these teachings, someone with a pure heart and faith who hears these teachings, and here I have to give negative marks for the translator, who ignored the word api, which turns out to be really important here. Shunuyat api. Even if they hear a little bit of these teachings, all of that is implied in that little word. Even if they happen to accidentally hear, it's like someone who drops off their elderly mother at class, and they're standing in the hall, in the lobby, and they accidentally hear me teaching some Bhagavad Gita before they go out the door. Sri Krishna says, that's a good thing. He says, even if they happen to accidentally hear just a tiny little bit, even then, saha api muktaha, even that person becomes liberated. If you just happen to be standing, this is what he says, if you just accidentally happen to be standing in the lobby, as I teach Bhagavad Gita, that's all you need. That's what he says. We had this discussion last week about the use of hyperbole, intentional exaggeration. So Sri Krishna is not saying that literally, if you just happen to hear a little fragment of these teachings, you instantly become enlightened. This is the poetic device called hyperbole. It's deliberate exaggeration, and as we said, it's a common device to inculcate devotion and reverence and respect, all of that value. And I've pointed out before that in advertising, truth doesn't work, right? If the advertiser says our product is pretty good, no one will buy it. It's the truth. Our product is it is pretty good. But when the advertiser says our product is the best of all the other products are poison. Ours is the only one that you should drink. You get the point. So it's necessary in certain circumstances to exaggerate. This is deliberate exaggeration. If you even hear just a little bit, saha api muktaha, that person will become liberated. Not only that, in the last line, prapnuyat, that person will gain shubhan lokan, pure, holy words, punya karmanam, of good karma. Almost a contradiction. Sopi muktaha, liberated, means you're not reborn. But if you happen to get reborn, you will go to some heavenly domain and enjoy yourself. The reason that no one would accuse this as being contradictory is it's hyperbole. It's not meant for, this is not for the sake of teaching. This is for the sake of stuti. Stuti means praise. So whenever we read a verse, we have to know what is the intent of that verse. Some verses are for the sake of teaching. Some verses are for the sake of stuti, praise. This is a praise verse. All right, leading us to Kachid tachutam partha, Kachide tachutam partha, Tvayakagrena chetasa, Tvayakagrena chetasa, Kachidajnana sammohaha, Kachidajnana sammohaha, Pranashtaste dhananjaya, Pranashtaste dhananjaya. Kachit is an article of question. It's like a question mark. So Sri Krishna is asking Arjuna, Partha, O Arjuna, O son of Kunti, Kachit, etat shutam. Has etat, this, everything Sri Krishna has this etat shutam, has this been heard? Notice how the letters change due to grammatical rules. Etat shutam becomes etat shutam. It's rules of sandhi. So, O Arjuna, etat shutam tvaya. Has this been heard tvaya by you? That's beginning of the next line. More sandhi, tvaya by you, who is ekagrena chetasa, by you with a chetas, with a mind which is ekagra, one-pointed. O Arjuna, have you listened to this with a one-pointed mind? Was Arjuna paying attention? By the way, that's not trivial. Where are they located? On a battlefield? And Arjuna can see very clearly that his enemies are raising their spears and bows, and their horses are going, and the elephants are trumpeting and all of this, and Arjuna sees all of this happening, so you might wonder, has he been distracted by the activities on the battlefield to such an extent where he doesn't really pay attention to what Sri Krishna is teaching? So it's not surprising that Sri Krishna asks, O Arjuna, excuse me. O Arjuna, have you been listening with a one-pointed mind? And then he continues to ask, Kachit, another question. Ajnana, that word te in the second line, your. Te, your ajnana sammoha. Has your ajnana sammoha, is such a perfect word. Sammoha. Moha, confusion. Sammoha, complete confusion. Extreme confusion. Referring to Arjuna's dilemma that we saw in chapter 1 itself, where Arjuna is so overwhelmed by this stressful situation that he has what amounts to a panic attack on the battlefield. His hands are shaking, he's sweating, his mouth is dry, he drops his bow and arrow, he gets dizzy, he falls to the seat of the chariot. He is having a panic attack. Sammoha refers to that panic attack. And that panic attack is the result of ajnana. So here the Sanskrit is very clear. Sammoha, complete confusion, which is the result of ajnana, ignorance. And ignorance in what sense? In a spiritual sense. Suppose Arjuna was already enlightened at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna asked Sri Krishna, drive our chariot out on a battlefield so I can see those with whom I have to fight. And he sees among his opponents, he sees Bhishma, the family patriarch. He sees Kripa, family teacher. He sees Dronacharya, his teacher, another teacher, great teacher. And he sees all his other family members gathered on the other side of the battlefield. If Arjuna were enlightened, would his response be a little different? Would he suffer a panic attack? You get the point. So it is Arjuna's not being grounded in spiritual wisdom that allowed him to be overwhelmed by his emotions. Arjuna was overwhelmed by his emotions, and it took these 18 chapters to bring Arjuna out of that. 18 chapters of, actually skip chapter 1, so 17 chapters of spiritual wisdom meant to lift Arjuna out of that sammoha. And let me just point out one more time, you've heard me say this before, but it's so important. This points to why the Bhagavad Gita is the most widely studied scripture. And you remember me saying this just in the last class or the class before that, where I said Arjuna's problem was an emotional problem. Right? Arjuna standing in a chariot, is he wondering, what is the meaning of life? Who is God? How did this world get here in the first place? Is that his problem? It's a moral conflict. He felt, how can I fight against my own family members, knowing full well that it was dharma to fight? He knew full well. So he had this dharma sankata, as we've discussed before, this intense moral conflict. It was an emotional problem. And here we have one more reference to the fact that Arjuna's problem was emotional. Sammoha, the being overwhelmed by his confusion, by this emotional turmoil, which was the result of ajnana, ignorance, in a sense of not being grounded in the spiritual wisdom which Sri Krishna has taught here. So, Kachit ajnana sammohaha, O Arjuna, has your emotional confusion, born of ignorance, has it been pranashtaha, completely destroyed? Nashta, destroyed, pranashta, completely destroyed. Have Sri Krishna is speaking, so he says, have my teachings been effective in relieving you of your emotional turmoil born of lack of spiritual grounding? Has my teachings worked in freeing you from that? Presumably, if Arjuna said no, we'd probably have another 18 chapters. And obviously, as you understand, Arjuna doesn't say no, but the point is Sri Krishna was ready to continue. He didn't just say, that's it, go fight the war. He actually gave Arjuna an opportunity to ask for more teachings, and we'll see Arjuna's response. He says, Arjuna uvacha, nashto moha smritir labdha, nashto moha smritir labdha, tvat prasaran mayachyuta, tvat prasaran mayachyuta, stitosmi gata sandehaha, stitosmi gata sandehaha, karishye vachanam tava, karishye vachanam tava, stitosi gata san. Okay. Just checking the meter, and just caught me by surprise. Start in the second line. Tvat prasadat. Prasada here means blessings. Tvat, your. Tvat prasadat. Through your blessings, achyuta, O Krishna, through your blessings, maya, by me, for me, my moha, in the first line, my moha, emotional confusion. That's what he's referring to. That's where the Bhagavad Gita began, with Arjuna being overwhelmed by his emotions. That's what the word moha here. Moha, of course, can mean many things in many contexts. In the context of the Bhagavad Gita, here Arjuna is referring to his being overwhelmed by the intensity of his emotions, and in chapter 1. He says that moha, that emotional turmoil, nashtaha, has been destroyed. Not only that, smriti labdha. He says, labdha, I have regained smriti. Now, literally, smriti means memory, but don't take it so literally. It's not like Arjuna have amnesia. I don't think so. So smriti labdha means, in English we have this expression, to regain your senses. That's exactly what he means. He's regained his senses. He now has a clear mind. In the midst of that panic attack, just to recall, Arjuna, and here's an important point we've discussed before, but we can see it here very vividly. When you are in the midst of emotional turmoil, in fact, this is the irony of life. When you are in a difficult situation, you need to think clearly so that you can make the best possible decision, correct? How ironic it is that in those various situations, your emotions get stirred up, and with the emotions stirred up, you are less likely to make the best possible decision. It's a setup for disaster. We are programmed in such a way that when we need to have a clear mind in a time of crisis, those are the times our minds are actually least clear and most subject to being overwhelmed by our emotions. It is the way we are wired as human beings. Animals, primates, remember, apes are our cousins. So it's a whole fight or flight response. It is biologically wired into us. And no doubt, Arjuna felt that fight or flight response, including flight. Arjuna actually debated running away from the battlefield. Remember when he said, back in chapter 1, he said it would be, chapter 2, it would be better for me to go and live on alms. In the beginning of chapter 2. Instead of being drenched, powerful language, instead of being drenched in the blood of my family members, it would be better for me to leave this battlefield and live as a beggar living on alms. Arjuna was ready to run away from the battlefield. This is his fight or flight response. How to come out of that? That's what this whole teaching is about, right? When you are sufficiently spiritually grounded, you won't feel all that anxiety. You won't feel overwhelmed by your emotions. Many years ago, I did a video on being at the center of the storm. You've all seen pictures of a big hurricane with all the winds and all the clouds and the circular form. And most of you know that in the middle of the hurricane, the winds are calm, perfectly calm. The outer bands of the hurricane, the winds are going 100 miles an hour or more, but in the middle of that storm, it's perfectly calm. With Sri Krishna's teachings, it is possible to be in the midst of a storm, not a hurricane, the storm that is, sorry to say, the storm that is your extended family. It happens a lot. And if it's not your extended family, then it's at your workplace, or it's with your neighbors, or it's on the road, wherever it is, there is a storm. And you are in that storm, being battered around by the winds of that storm. It is possible, with the help of these teachings, to find a still point in the center of that storm. To the extent that while everyone around you is shouting in anger, you'll just be calm. Why not? If these teachings go in, why would you shout? Why would you get upset? Why would you get engaged in all this emotional turmoil? With the help of his teachings, you would have what we call a healthy detachment. That's an important adjective, healthy. There's such a thing as an unhealthy detachment. What is the unhealthy detachment? When everyone is shouting and you say, I don't care, and you walk out the door. Hey, wait a minute. It's your family. You can't just walk out the door on your family. That is an unhealthy detachment, where you're running away from your responsibilities. That's not what these teachings are meant for. What these teachings can empower you with is a healthy detachment, which means to remain in the midst of all those shouting family members without shouting back, without being upset, without being angry, without being hurt, being clear-minded. The most amazing thing happens. When I want to convey this very powerfully. The most amazing thing happens when somebody is shouting at you and you don't get angry or hurt. The amazing thing is that usually we get angry or hurt, right, when somebody shouts at us. And that anger and or hurt prevents us from really understanding the situation properly. When you are free from anger and hurt, and that person is shouting at you, you'll actually feel compassion for that person. Are they having a good day? They're so angry, they're shouting. They're miserable. They're suffering. Of course, if you get angry or hurt, then you won't be sensitive to their suffering. But when you have this healthy detachment, born of these teachings, instead of shouting back, you will feel compassion for the person who's shouting at you, and you will act appropriately. Depending on the situation, whatever needs to be done to improve the situation, you will do that. It is possible to be at that still point in the center of the storm, even with people shouting at you. You can remain perfectly calm. That's the goal. And that goal is achieved through being grounded in this spiritual wisdom. You can't fake it, right? You can't I want to be compassionate. How long will that work? As a person is shouting at you using his 4-letter words, and you want to be compassionate, how long will that stay? It'll get just blown away. It won't work. You can't fake it. It depends on being grounded in these teachings. So, finally, Arjuna says, Stitaha asmi. There's a double meaning here also. Stitaha asmi gata sandeha. Asmi, I am gata sandeha. I am completely free from my doubts. I am stitaha. I am abiding. I am remaining free from doubts. That would be a very common translation. But stitaha literally means standing. You remember back in chapter 1, end of chapter 1, he falls to the seat of his chariot. And we might presume that he has been sitting down in his chariot throughout this whole discourse as Sri Krishna has been standing and giving this spiritual instruction to Arjuna. Now Arjuna says, Stitaha asmi. Now I am standing up. Now I am ready. Ready for what? 10 verses before, we had this discussion, I think 2 classes ago. 10 verses before, when Sri Krishna was wrapping up his teachings, Sri Krishna told Arjuna, Yatechasi tatakuru. He said, okay, Arjuna, I'm done teaching you. Now go and do whatever you want. Remember that class? We had talked about that quite a bit. And how that's a very powerful statement, the statement of a true teacher. A true teacher is not one who tells you what to do. A true teacher is one who teaches you what to do, not this command thing. So Sri Krishna taught Arjuna, and Sri Krishna also knew that Arjuna understood properly, and Arjuna would definitely take the right course of action. So Sri Krishna could comfortably say, Yatechasi, as you desire, tatakuru. Go ahead and do whatever you want. And 10 verses later, what does Arjuna reply? Karishye vachanam tava. I'll follow your instructions. So Sri Krishna says, do whatever you want. And Arjuna's response, to paraphrase, is, okay, I want to follow whatever you tell me to do. Because at this point, Arjuna has been freed from all this emotional turmoil. Arjuna is thinking clearly again, as we saw, and Arjuna now recognizes there is no better source of guidance than Sri Krishna. And of course, that applies not just to Arjuna, it applies to all of us. There is no better source of guidance than the teachings of Sri Krishna, which is why we've been studying this for several years now. And in the very next class, we will come to an end. Oh, let me just make sure you get the Sanskrit here. Tava vachanam, your words, karishye. I will follow, I will carry out your words, I will follow your guidance. So, Sri Krishna's guidance being the most effective, how can we go wrong? So we're following his guidance, and that his wonderful Bhagavad Gita will come to an end in the next class. We will finish the remaining verses. We won't, this class will not come to an end immediately, because it would be really nice at the end, we've done this once before, at the end of the Bhagavad Gita is a wonderful time to learn the Gita Dhyana. There are several verses that are traditionally chanted before the Bhagavad Gita. We haven't followed that tradition. It's a decision I've made. Sometimes if you start a class with too much devotional chanting, it takes away from the class, so we haven't done that. On the other hand, these dhyana shlokas, these prayer verses, are really important and really wonderful, so we will study them starting in our next class, and we'll also at the very end do an overview, a summary of the whole Bhagavad Gita. That overview then will help you a year or two from now, if you say, what was that Sri Krishna said? And then you'll know where to look. You'll be able to find the passage or find the verse that you remember. So this class will go on for a while, and of course then we'll take up another topic. Okay, some important announcements. Tomorrow, Sunday, is our once a month we have a Samashraya support group, which is a support group for caregivers of family members who are suffering from mental illness. So if you are a caregiver of a family member who has mental illness, please come tomorrow at 4 p.m. for the support group. Tomorrow then at 6, satsang, question answer. I think the weather will be really nice, so we'll sit outside in the picnic area. And the weather being nice, be nice if you enjoy some gardening projects. There's some gardening projects that will also be going on after this class, so you can meet in the lobby. We'll conclude with our brief prayers at the altar. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Gavingavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatahana Shrinvan Utibasida Sadhanam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramhanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet. asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma hamritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.